The Ohio Bloodbath, the priest who slaughtered 10 men over a stolen confession tape. The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Cathedral in downtown Cleveland, Ohio, creating a rhythmic percussion that echoed through the empty nave. Father Thomas Brennan sat alone in the confession booth, his hands trembling as he stared at the ornate wooden lattice that separated him from countless souls who had poured their sins into this sacred space. At 52 years old, Thomas had dedicated 30 years of his life to the priesthood, believing wholeheartedly in the sanctity of confession and the power of redemption. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his black cassock pressed and pristine. But beneath this composed exterior, a storm was brewing that would soon shatter everything he held sacred. The cathedral itself was a monument to faith, built in 1924 during Cleveland's industrial heyday when steel mills and manufacturing plants made the city one of America's most prosperous. Immigrants from Poland, Italy, Ireland, and Germany had pooled their resources to construct this magnificent Gothic structure, its spires reaching toward heaven like prayers made of stone. The interior was breathtaking, vaulted ceilings that soared 60 feet high, stained glass windows depicting scenes from the life of Christ, marble floors polished by generations of faithful footsteps, and rows of wooden pews that could seat nearly 1,000 worshippers. Thomas had served here for 15 years, and he knew every corner of this building, every creaking floorboard, every spot where light filtered through the windows at different times of day. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when Marcus Delgado first entered his confessional. Thomas had heard thousands of confessions over the decades, affairs, thefts, lies, moments of weakness and shame that people carried like weights on their souls. He'd developed a kind of emotional distance, a professional compassion that allowed him to offer guidance without being crushed by the accumulated sins of humanity. But something about Marcus's voice, cold, calculated, devoid of genuine remorse, made his blood run cold. The man who knelt on the other side of the lattice spoke with the casual indifference of someone ordering coffee, not confessing to crimes that destroyed lives. Marcus confessed to being part of a criminal organization that trafficked young women across state lines, detailing operations with such clinical precision that Thomas felt physically ill. He described how they recruited vulnerable girls from bus stations and homeless shelters, promised them legitimate work, then trapped them in cycles of debt and violence. He talked about the money they made, the corrupt officials they paid off, the careful systems they'd built to avoid detection. Thomas's stomach churned as Marcus listed addresses, dates, and names with the casualness of someone discussing a business venture. But what came next changed everything. If you're watching this story unfold, please subscribe to our channel and drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. We appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to engage with these stories. Marcus revealed that he had recorded this confession on a hidden device, a tiny digital recorder concealed in his jacket pocket. Thomas could hear the faint click as Marcus pressed a button, playing back a few seconds of their conversation. The priest's own voice echoed tinnily through the confessional booth, and Thomas felt his world tilt. Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor, as he explained his plan. He intended to use the tape as leverage, to expose the church's secrets, to blackmail Thomas into silence about other crimes he knew the organization was planning. The confession seal, that sacred bond between priest and penitent that stretched back over 1,000 years of Catholic tradition, had been weaponized. Thomas sat frozen in the booth long after Marcus left, his mind racing through the implications. The confession seal was absolute in Catholic doctrine. Priests who violated it faced automatic excommunication. The code of canon law was explicit. The sacramental seal is inviolable. Therefore, it is absolutely forbidden for a confessor to betray in any way a penitent in words or in any manner and for any reason. Thomas had studied this in seminary, had internalized it as one of the foundational principles of his priesthood. He could never reveal what he'd heard, not to police, not to his bishop, not even to save lives. But Marcus had violated that sacred trust by recording it. The tape existed somewhere in the world, a ticking time bomb that could destroy not just Thomas's reputation, but potentially expose the church to lawsuits, scandal, and worse. Thomas imagined the headlines, the media frenzy, the betrayed faces of his parishioners. He thought about the victims of Marcus's trafficking operation, women who might never be rescued because Thomas couldn't break the seal to help them. The moral paradox was crushing. His silence protected evil, but breaking the seal would violate everything he believed in. For 3 sleepless nights, Thomas wrestled with his conscience, pacing his modest rectory apartment, a 2-room space above the church offices with worn carpet and furniture donated by parishioners over the years. He prayed until his knees ached against the hardwood floor, begging God for guidance, for clarity, for some divine intervention that would solve this impossible dilemma. Every principle he'd built his life upon was collapsing like a house of cards. Thomas had joined the priesthood at 22, straight out of college, driven by a genuine calling to serve God and help people. He'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Akron, the youngest of 5 children in a devoutly Catholic family. His father had worked in a tire factory for 40 years, his mother had cleaned houses to make ends meet, and they'd sacrificed to send him to Catholic schools where his faith had deepened and matured. On Friday morning, Thomas made a decision that would condemn his soul. He would find that tape and destroy it no matter the cost. The reasoning seemed clear in his fevered mind. If the tape was destroyed, the violation of the confession seal would be erased, the sacred space would be protected, and the church would be safe from scandal. He told himself he was doing God's work, protecting the institution that had given his life meaning and purpose. But beneath these rationalizations, something darker was taking root. An obsession that would transform a gentle priest into a calculating killer. Thomas began by doing something he'd never done in 30 years of priesthood. He broke the confession seal. Using the details Marcus had carelessly shared during his confession, Thomas started tracking the criminal organization. He learned that Marcus was just one member of a 10-person crew operating out of various locations across Cleveland's east side. They ran their operations from abandoned warehouses in the Collinwood neighborhood, used encrypted phones and rotating safe houses to avoid detection, and maintained a network of legitimate businesses, convenience stores, laundromats, auto repair shops, as fronts for money laundering. Thomas spent weeks studying them, watching from his old sedan parked in shadowy alleys, documenting their patterns with the meticulous attention to detail that had once made him an excellent seminary student. He bought a composition notebook and filled it with observations, sketching maps of their movements, noting who met with whom and when. The work consumed him completely. He began missing morning mass, forgetting appointments with parishioners, neglecting his duties. Other priests at the cathedral noticed the change, but attributed it to stress or burnout, common enough in their profession. The neighborhood where Marcus's crew operated was a study in urban decay and resilience. East Cleveland had once been prosperous, home to middle-class families who worked in the city's manufacturing sector. But decades of economic decline had left many blocks scarred by abandonment. Houses stood vacant with boarded windows and collapsing porches, their lawns overgrown with weeds. Yet between these ruins, pockets of life persisted. Corner stores where old men gathered to play dominoes, churches where faithful congregations still met every Sunday, families who refused to abandon their homes despite the deterioration around them. The first man Thomas killed was Anthony Russo, a low-level enforcer who worked as Marcus's driver. Thomas had followed Anthony for 2 weeks, learning his routines. Anthony was 28 years old, originally from a Cleveland suburb, with a record of assault charges and petty theft dating back to his teens. He lived in a rundown apartment on St. Clair Avenue and spent most evenings at a dive bar called Lucky's on Euclid Avenue. The bar was the kind of place where the neon sign out front flickered intermittently, where the floor was perpetually sticky, and where bartenders didn't ask questions as long as you paid cash. Thomas followed Anthony to Lucky's on a foggy November evening. The neighborhood was industrial, full of shuttered factories and broken streetlights that left long stretches of darkness between pools of yellow light. The fog rolled in from Lake Erie, thick and cold, muffling sounds and reducing visibility to mere feet in some places. Thomas waited in his car, rosary beads wrapped around his knuckles, praying mechanically while his eyes never left the bar's entrance. He'd been sitting there for 3 hours when Anthony finally stumbled out near midnight, drunk and careless. The parking lot behind Lucky's was a desolate space surrounded by chain-link fencing, littered with broken bottles and discarded tires. A single security light cast harsh shadows, creating pockets of absolute darkness. Thomas approached Anthony under the pretense of offering spiritual guidance to a lost soul. He'd changed out of his clerical collar, wearing instead dark jeans and a heavy jacket that he'd purchased at a thrift store specifically for this purpose. Anthony laughed at first when Thomas mentioned God and redemption, his words slurred, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. He said something crude about priests and altar boys, a joke that had become depressingly common in the years since the church's abuse scandals had dominated headlines. But Anthony's laughter died when Thomas pulled out a length of rope he'd taken from the church's utility closet, thick hemp rope that had been used for bell ringing before the cathedral had modernized its systems. Thomas had practiced the movements in his apartment, watching videos online about restraint techniques, studying how to immobilize someone quickly. The knowledge felt profane, corrupting, but he'd justified it as necessary. When he moved, muscle memory took over from his practice sessions. Anthony fought back hard, despite his intoxication, landing punches that split Thomas's lip and bruised his ribs. They crashed against a dumpster, the metal ringing out in the foggy night. Anthony was younger, stronger, but Thomas fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose, a man who had already crossed a line he could never uncross. The struggle seemed to last forever, though it was probably only minutes. When it was over, Anthony's body lay crumpled against the dumpster, his face purple, his eyes bulging and lifeless. Thomas stood there, gasping, his hands covered in blood from where Anthony had clawed at him, his cassock, which he'd worn under the jacket out of some twisted sense that he was still doing God's work, torn and stained. Thomas felt no remorse, only a cold clarity mixed with panic. He searched Anthony's pockets frantically, his hands shaking, finding a phone, $200 in cash, car keys, and a wallet with a photo of a young woman and a toddler. Anthony's family, Thomas realized with a distant twinge of guilt that he immediately suppressed. But there was no tape, no recording device, no evidence of where such a thing might be kept. This was just the beginning, Thomas understood. He'd have to search them all. Over the next 3 months, Thomas hunted the remaining members of Marcus's crew with systematic precision. He transformed his rectory apartment into a war room, taping photos and notes to his walls like a detective tracking a serial killer, never recognizing the irony that he had become exactly that. He learned their routines, their weaknesses, their haunts. He studied each man, researching their backgrounds through public records and social media, building psychological profiles that would help him predict their movements and exploit their vulnerabilities. The second victim was Leonard Price. a 34-year-old ex-convict who handled logistics for the trafficking operation. Leonard had done 2 stretches in Mansfield Correctional Institution for armed robbery and had come out harder and more careful than before. Thomas ambushed him in an abandoned warehouse on Cleveland's industrial flats, a desolate area near the Cuyahoga River where old steel mills had once employed thousands. The warehouse still smelled of machine oil and rust, its windows long since broken, pigeons nesting in the rafters and leaving the floors covered in droppings. Leonard had been using the location to store stolen goods, electronics, designer clothes, prescription medications that the organization moved through their legitimate business fronts. Thomas waited for him in the darkness for hours, hidden behind a stack of rotting pallets, armed with a tire iron he'd found among the debris. The cold seeped through his clothes, making his joints ache, but he remained absolutely still, focused on his mission. When Leonard arrived with a flashlight checking on inventory, Thomas struck from behind with brutal efficiency. The attack was swift and savage, driven by Thomas's growing obsession with finding the confession tape. He'd stopped thinking of these men as human beings with families and histories. They'd become obstacles between him and his goal, problems to be solved with violence. The tire iron connected with Leonard's skull with a sickening crack that echoed through the empty warehouse. Leonard went down hard, tried to crawl away, blood streaming from his head, but Thomas followed, striking again and again until movement ceased. Again, the search yielded nothing but burner phones and money. The tape remained elusive. The killings became easier with each one, the moral barriers breaking down like a dam, eroding under constant pressure. Father Thomas Brennan, once a gentle shepherd of souls who had wept at funerals and rejoiced at baptisms, became a predator stalking Cleveland's underworld. He killed Vincent Shaw outside a strip club on Payne Avenue, strangling him in the back seat of his own car, while Vincent was distracted counting money from his night's work, managing the club's illegal gambling operation in the back room. Thomas had learned that Vincent kept detailed records of the organization's finances, and he'd hoped those records might mention the tape's location. He killed brothers Ramon and Diego Martinez in their safe house on East 116th Street, a shabby duplex in a neighborhood where gunshots were common enough that neighbors had learned not to look too closely at suspicious activity. The brothers were twins, 26 years old, immigrants from Honduras who had fallen into Marcus's orbit through desperation and lack of options. Thomas used a gun for the first time, a 9mm pistol he'd taken from Vincent Shaw, and the violence felt more distant, more clinical than the intimate brutality of strangulation or beating. The gun made killing feel like pressing a button, mechanical and impersonal, which somehow made it easier to bear psychologically. Each murder was methodical, each search increasingly desperate and invasive. Thomas tore apart their apartments, their cars, their personal belongings with manic intensity. He found drugs, money, stolen goods, evidence of countless crimes. But the confession tape remained a phantom. He began to wonder if Marcus had been lying, if the tape was just psychological warfare, but the possibility that it existed somewhere drove him forward like an addict chasing a high he couldn't quite reach. Detective Sarah Chen of the Cleveland Police Department's Homicide Division first noticed the pattern in early February. 6 bodies in 3 months, all connected to the same criminal organization, all killed with unusual brutality, but also with a strange kind of precision that suggested the killer had purpose beyond simple violence. Sarah was a 15-year veteran of the force, known for her analytical mind and relentless work ethic that had earned her commendations and the respect of her colleagues, even in a department that still struggled with old-school attitudes about women in law enforcement. She was the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had arrived in Cleveland in the 1970s and built a successful restaurant in Cleveland's Asiatown neighborhood. Her parents, Michael and Lin Chen, had worked 18-hour days to establish the Golden Dragon, a modest establishment that became known for authentic Cantonese cuisine and warm hospitality. Sarah had grown up in the restaurant, doing homework at corner tables between helping with dishes and seating customers. She'd learned English and Cantonese simultaneously, navigating between American culture at school and traditional Chinese values at home, understanding from an early age the complexities of community, loyalty, and moral codes that existed outside mainstream law. Sarah sat in her cluttered office at the 2nd District headquarters on Detroit Avenue, surrounded by case files and crime scene photos spread across her desk. The office was cramped, shared with 3 other detectives, the walls institutional beige, the furniture government issue and worn. Her desk was organized chaos, stacks of folders, a coffee mug from the Police Athletic League, framed photos of her parents and her partner of 6 years, Jennifer Walsh, who taught high school English. The victims had records: assault, trafficking, racketeering, but that didn't make their murders any less heinous in Sarah's mind. Her job was to solve homicides, not to judge who deserved justice. What troubled Sarah most was the methodology. The killer was careful, leaving minimal forensic evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses who could provide useful descriptions. But there was also something almost ritualistic about how the bodies were left. She noticed that each victim had been positioned with their hands folded across their chest, an oddly reverent gesture that seemed completely at odds with the violence of their deaths. It was as if the killer was performing some kind of ceremony, showing respect even while committing murder. The contradiction haunted Sarah as she pored over autopsy reports and crime scene photographs. The break came when she interviewed Marcus Delgado, who had finally been picked up on an unrelated warrant for skipping a court date on a previous assault charge. Marcus was paranoid when they brought him in, jumping at shadows, convinced that someone was systematically eliminating his crew. In the interrogation room at the Justice Center downtown, a sterile space with concrete walls painted institutional grey, a metal table bolted to the floor, and a mirror that everyone knew was one-way glass, Marcus chain-smoked despite the no-smoking policy, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. His lawyer, a public defender named James Morrison, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, advised him to say nothing, but fear had loosened Marcus's tongue. Sarah pressed him about enemies, rival organizations, anyone who might want his people dead. Marcus's answers were evasive at first, claiming he ran a legitimate import-export business, that his associates were just workers who'd gotten into trouble on their own time. But Sarah laid out the evidence. 6 bodies, all connected to Marcus's organization, all killed within 3 months. She mentioned witness statements that placed several victims with Marcus days before their deaths. She explained that protective custody was an option if Marcus cooperated, but if he stayed silent, he'd be released back onto the streets where whoever was hunting his people could find him. That's when Marcus finally broke. He told her about the confession tape, his words tumbling out in a rush. He described going to St. Michael's Cathedral on a whim, drunk and feeling invincible, deciding it would be amusing to confess his crimes to a priest just to see the reaction. He'd brought a small digital recorder, the kind journalists use for interviews, and concealed it in his jacket. He described the priest: older, grey hair, intense eyes that seemed to look right through him, a quiet voice that remained steady even as Marcus detailed horrific crimes. Marcus claimed he'd noticed the same priest watching him multiple times in the weeks before the killing started, always at a distance, always disappearing before Marcus could confront him. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she listened. A priest turned killer was almost incomprehensible, yet it explained the ritualistic positioning of the bodies, the methodical nature of the murders, the lack of typical criminal motivation like money or territory. She asked the obvious question: Where was the tape now? Marcus's answer sent chills down her spine. He'd given it to his boss, Raymond Ray Kowalski, for safekeeping. Raymond had been a 48-year-old career criminal who ran the organization's operations from a seemingly legitimate trucking company. He'd been murdered 2 weeks earlier, shot execution style in his office, and the tape was missing from his possessions. Raymond's murder had been particularly brutal. Thomas had gotten into the trucking company's offices by posing as a priest, bringing religious materials for the employees. Raymond's secretary was a devout Catholic who had welcomed Father Brennan warmly, never suspecting that the gentle clergyman was there to kill her boss. Thomas had waited until the office was empty during lunch hour, then confronted Raymond in his private office. Raymond had recognized him from the description Marcus must have provided, had reached for a gun in his desk drawer, but Thomas had been faster, driven by desperate purpose. Sarah drove to St. Michael's Cathedral that same afternoon, the winter sun already setting behind Cleveland's downtown skyline at 4 in the afternoon, casting long shadows across Public Square, where the soldiers' and sailors' monument stood covered in a light dusting of snow. The cathedral was magnificent even in the fading light, all soaring spires and intricate stonework that spoke of an era when faith was the centerpiece of community life. Sarah had been raised Buddhist by her parents, though they weren't particularly religious, and she'd only been inside Catholic churches for investigations or community events. The grandeur still impressed her. She found Father Thomas in the sacristy, preparing for evening mass. He was laying out vestments on a wooden table, green chasuble for ordinary time, white alb, stole embroidered with gold thread. The sacristy was a small room adjacent to the sanctuary, filled with cabinets containing liturgical items, shelves of prayer books, and a sink for ritual washing. The air smelled of incense and old wood. When Sarah introduced herself, showing her badge, and mentioned she wanted to talk about confessions, Thomas's composure cracked for just a moment, a flicker of something dark and desperate in his eyes, his hand freezing mid-motion over the vestments before he regained control. His smile when it came was practiced, professional, the same smile he'd given parishioners thousands of times. They spoke in his office, a cramped room on the second floor of the rectory building, filled with theological books, volumes of church history, commentaries on scripture, lives of saints, and religious icons, including a crucifix above his desk and a statue of the Virgin Mary on a shelf. The office's single window looked out over the church parking lot, and beyond that, the Cleveland skyline. Thomas was charming and helpful, explaining the sanctity of the confession seal and how it was absolute, how no priest could ever break it under any circumstances. He spoke about the history of the practice, citing canon law and papal documents, his voice taking on the practice cadence of a professor delivering a familiar lecture. Sarah watched him carefully, noting how his hands gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles white with tension, how a thin sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead, despite the room being quite cool. She asked if he knew Marcus Delgado. Thomas said the name meant nothing to him, that he heard hundreds of confessions and didn't typically remember names or faces. The confession booth created anonymity by design. But his eyes betrayed him, darting away from Sarah's steady gaze, focusing on points around the room rather than meeting her eyes directly. Sarah had interrogated enough suspects to know when someone was lying. Over the next few weeks, Sarah built her case methodically, brick by brick. She obtained surveillance footage from businesses near the murder scenes, spending hours reviewing grainy black and white footage from security cameras at convenience stores, gas stations, and warehouses. She found images of an older sedan, a 1998 Honda Accord, tan, with a small dent in the rear bumper, that matched the make and model registered to St. Michael's Cathedral for use by its priests. The car appeared near 4 different murder scenes within the relevant time frames, sometimes hours before a body was discovered, sometimes the night before. She interviewed parishioners at St. Michael's, presenting herself as conducting a routine investigation into neighborhood crime patterns. An elderly woman named Dorothy Kowalski, no relation to Raymond, mentioned that Father Thomas had seemed distracted and troubled in recent months, that he'd lost significant weight, his cassock hanging loose where it had once fit perfectly, and had developed dark circles under his eyes that made him look perpetually exhausted. A younger parishioner, Maria Santos, said that Father Thomas had cancelled their scheduled marriage counseling sessions twice without explanation, something completely out of character for a priest who had always been punctual and dedicated. Sarah discovered that Thomas had withdrawn $15,000 in cash from his personal account over a 3-month period, unusual for a priest who lived modestly on the church stipend of roughly $30,000 a year. The withdrawals came in increments, 500 here, 1,000 there, from various ATMs across the city, suggesting someone trying to avoid drawing attention. Sarah traced how Thomas had used the money, purchasing a gun from a private seller who remembered the nervous priest who paid in hundreds, buying dark clothing at thrift stores across the city, paying cash for gas during his surveillance of targets. The evidence was circumstantial, but mounting into a picture that became clearer with each piece. Sarah presented her findings to the prosecutor's office, where Assistant District Attorney Michelle Hartman reviewed the case with the skeptical eye of someone who had seen too many promising cases fall apart at trial. Michelle was a sharp woman in her early 40s, known for her meticulous preparation and high conviction rate. She pointed out the challenges: no physical evidence directly linking Thomas to the murders, no witnesses who could place him at the scenes, and the potential for a confession-seal defense that might muddy the waters with jurors. But Michelle agreed to seek warrants for Thomas's apartment, car, and office. The searches, conducted on a cold March morning, yielded damning evidence. In Thomas's apartment, hidden in a locked drawer beneath his bed, detectives found a composition notebook filled with surveillance notes, detailed maps of his victims' movements, photographs he'd taken while stalking them. They found clothing stained with blood that forensic analysis would later match to 3 different victims. In his car's trunk, wrapped in plastic, they found the tire iron used to kill Leonard Price, still bearing traces of blood and hair. In his office at the cathedral, behind a false panel in his bookshelf that he'd constructed himself, they found the gun used to kill the Martinez brothers and Raymond Kowalski, along with nearly $10,000 in cash. Thomas killed his 9th victim, Carlos Mendez, during a desperate rage when another search yielded no tape. Carlos was a 31-year-old enforcer who handled security for the organization's trafficking operations, a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning home with PTSD that the VA system had failed to adequately treat. Carlos had fallen into Marcus's organization through a combination of desperation for money and the familiar structure of violence that military service had normalized. Carlos died in an alley behind a grocery store on Clark Avenue, in the Tremont neighborhood where hipster coffee shops existed alongside traditional Polish bakeries and Mexican taquerias. Thomas had lured him there with a phone call claiming to have information about who was killing his associates. When Carlos arrived, suspicious but curious, Thomas attacked with such fury that his own hands fractured from the beating. Carlos's face was unrecognizable when it was over, his skull crushed, his features obliterated by the sustained violence. Thomas stood over the body, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding, and realized with sudden clarity that he'd lost himself completely. The man he'd been, the compassionate priest who'd comforted the dying, holding their hands in hospital rooms and nursing homes, who'd married young couples with tears of joy in his eyes, who'd baptized babies and felt genuine wonder at new life and new beginnings, was gone, replaced by this murderous stranger whose hands wouldn't stop shaking. He looked at those hands, covered in Carlos's blood, and barely recognized them as his own. The 10th and final victim was Marcus Delgado himself. Sarah had kept Marcus in protective custody at the Cuyahoga County Jail, but bureaucratic errors and overcrowding, chronic problems in a system that hadn't been adequately funded in decades, led to him being transferred to a different facility in Lorain County. The transfer was supposed to be confidential, but information leaked, as it often did in systems where underpaid corrections officers sometimes supplemented their income by selling information. Thomas learned about the transfer through contacts he'd developed in Cleveland's underworld. Criminals who thought he was just another corrupt priest looking to profit from their sins, who had no idea he was the killer systematically eliminating Marcus's organization. A dealer named Ricky Santos, who Thomas had encountered during his investigations, mentioned the transfer casually during a conversation, thinking the priest might find it interesting. Thomas's heart had raced when he heard the news. This was his last chance to find the tape. On a cold March night, with temperatures hovering around freezing and a bitter wind blowing off Lake Erie, Thomas intercepted the transport van on a quiet stretch of road near the Cuyahoga River. He'd stolen a police uniform from a costume shop in Palmer, a suburban shopping district where he was unlikely to be recognized, and set up a fake roadblock using construction barriers he'd found at an abandoned work site. The deception was amateurish, but it was late, the roads were empty, and the corrections officers were tired from a long shift. The van stopped at the barriers, confused. Thomas approached wearing the ill-fitting uniform, and in the chaos that followed, shouts, confusion, Marcus recognizing the priest and screaming warnings, Thomas managed to pull Marcus from the van. He'd brought a gun, the same one he'd used before, and fired shots at the van's tires to prevent pursuit. The corrections officers radioed for help, but Thomas had precious minutes before backup would arrive. They struggled on the muddy riverbank, the dark water of the Cuyahoga River rushing past them, carrying chunks of ice from upriver and urban debris, shopping carts, tires, plastic bottles that collected along the shoreline. The river had once been so polluted it caught fire in 1969, a national embarrassment that led to environmental reforms, but it still carried the city's runoff and waste. Marcus was younger and stronger than the aging priest, and he fought with the desperation of a man who'd been running from death for months and refused to surrender. They rolled in the mud, trading blows. Marcus landed a solid punch to Thomas's jaw that made his teeth clack together, and Thomas felt something break in his face. But Thomas fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose, who had already destroyed his soul and would finish what he started. His hands found Marcus's throat, and unlike his other victims, he looked Marcus in the eyes as he squeezed, watching the recognition, the fear, the futile struggle as life faded. When Marcus finally stopped moving, Thomas searched his body frantically, ripping through pockets, tearing at his clothes, getting mud and blood under his fingernails. He found a wallet, cigarettes, a phone, but nothing else. No tape. The tape wasn't there. Thomas collapsed beside the body, sobbing uncontrollably, the weight of 10 murders crashing down on him like a physical force. He'd destroyed his soul, violated every vow he'd ever taken, killed 10 human beings, some of them criminals, yes, but still children of God, still souls capable of redemption, and the tape was still out there somewhere, or perhaps it never existed at all. Maybe Marcus had been lying from the beginning, using the threat of the tape to manipulate him, to see how a priest would react, and Thomas had fallen for it completely. Maybe the tape had been destroyed years ago. Maybe Raymond Kowalski had destroyed it after Marcus gave it to him, recognizing it as too dangerous to keep. Thomas would never know, and that uncertainty was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Sarah found him there an hour later. She'd been tracking Thomas's movements for days, anticipating that he'd make a move on Marcus when the opportunity arose. She'd positioned surveillance teams, monitored communications, prepared for exactly this scenario. She arrived with backup, their cruiser's lights painting the riverbank in alternating red and blue, reflecting off the dark water and creating an almost surreal atmosphere. Thomas didn't resist when he saw them coming. He stood slowly, muddy and blood-stained, his face swollen from Marcus's punches, and raised his hands in surrender. As Sarah cuffed him, reading him his rights in the practiced monotone of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, Thomas looked at her with hollow eyes and said, "I was trying to protect the church. I was trying to protect the sanctity of confession." His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from exertion and crying. Sarah felt a complex mixture of pity and disgust as she guided him toward her vehicle. She'd pursued many killers in her career, but few had seemed so completely broken, so utterly destroyed by their own actions. The trial was sensational, dominating Cleveland's news cycles for months. The media dubbed it the Ohio Bloodbath, and reporters camped outside the Cuyahoga County Courthouse every day of proceedings, their satellite trucks lining Ontario Street, correspondents doing stand-ups in front of the courthouse's Art Deco facade. Thomas's defense team, led by prominent criminal attorney Robert Walsh, no relation to Sarah's partner, tried to argue temporary insanity, painting him as a devoted priest pushed beyond reason by the violation of sacred trust. Walsh put Thomas on the stand, a risky move that allowed prosecutors to cross-examine him, but necessary to establish the mental state defense. Thomas testified about the confession seal, about the impossible moral dilemma Marcus had created, about how the fear of scandal had consumed him. He spoke about each victim, describing in clinical detail how he'd tracked and killed them, and several jurors looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Walsh tried to portray Thomas as a man broken by an impossible situation, someone who had snapped under pressure that no human should have to bear. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Michelle Hartman, countered with methodical evidence of premeditation, the planning, the stalking, the systematic elimination of 10 human beings. She showed the jury Thomas's notebook, reading entries that detailed surveillance, that analyzed victims' routines, that planned approaches and escape routes. She presented expert testimony from psychologists who evaluated Thomas and found him legally sane, fully aware of his actions and their wrongfulness. She called witnesses who testified about Thomas's character before the murders, parishioners who remembered him as kind and gentle, colleagues who spoke of his dedication to ministry, creating a stark contrast with the killer he'd become. During the trial, the confession tape became almost mythical, discussed endlessly by legal analysts and true crime podcasters. Marcus's organization had indeed existed. Prosecutors presented evidence of their trafficking operations, and several members not killed by Thomas were facing their own trials. But the tape itself was never found. Investigators searched every property associated with Raymond Kowalski, including a storage unit in North Olmsted, where he kept financial records, a lake house in Ashtabula County that he'd purchased through a shell company, and the homes of various associates. They interviewed dozens of people, offered deals for information, followed countless leads. Nothing. Some speculated that Marcus had destroyed it after recording it, that it had been a bluff all along, psychological warfare against a priest who took the confession seal seriously. Others believed it was hidden somewhere, perhaps in a safety deposit box or buried location that would never be discovered. Technology experts testified about the type of digital recorder Marcus might have used, explaining how such devices could store hours of audio on chips smaller than a fingernail, how easy it would be to hide or destroy such evidence. The tape became a symbol of the case itself, a phantom that had driven Thomas to unthinkable acts, perhaps never real at all. Father Michael Rodriguez, a priest from St. Idilbert's Parish in the Slavic village neighborhood, who had known Thomas for 20 years, testified as a character witness. Michael was in his mid-60s, a stocky man with kind eyes who spoke with a slight Spanish accent. He'd been born in Puerto Rico and come to Cleveland to serve the city's growing Latino population. He spoke about the burden of the confession seal, how it weighed on every priest who heard the sins of humanity day after day, year after year. Michael described Thomas as a man of deep faith who took his vows seriously, perhaps too seriously. He explained how the recording of a confession would have felt like a violation of everything Thomas believed in, like a poison infecting the sacred space where souls sought redemption. He compared it to a doctor being forced to harm a patient or a lawyer being compelled to betray a client. Professions built on trust that collapsed when that trust was violated. The courtroom was silent as Michael spoke, his voice emotional but controlled, and some jurors wiped away tears. But their sympathy didn't change the facts of 10 dead men. The jury deliberated for 3 days, sequestered in a hotel and forbidden from discussing the case except during official deliberation sessions. They reviewed evidence, asked for testimony to be read back, and debated the fine line between understanding why someone committed murder and excusing it. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they returned a verdict: guilty on all 10 counts of first-degree murder. Thomas showed no reaction when the verdicts were read, sitting perfectly still in his chair, staring at nothing. The judge, Patricia Holloway, a stern woman in her late 50s who had presided over countless violent crime cases during her 25-year career on the bench, showed no mercy during sentencing 2 weeks later. She had a reputation for tough but fair sentences, and she'd clearly been disturbed by this case. She spoke directly to Thomas, her voice heavy with disappointment and anger. "Father Brennan, you were entrusted with one of society's most sacred responsibilities, guiding souls toward redemption, offering comfort to the suffering, representing the best of what faith can offer humanity. Instead, you became an executioner, a predator who hunted and killed 10 men. You violated every principle of the faith you claim to serve. The Church teaches forgiveness, but justice demands accountability. You have shown no genuine remorse, only self-pity and justification. These men, criminals though they were, had families, had futures, had the possibility of redemption that you stole from them." She sentenced him to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring Thomas would die in prison. Thomas was transferred to the Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown, a maximum security facility opened in 1998 that housed the state's most dangerous criminals, death row inmates, serial killers, gang leaders, men convicted of the most heinous crimes. The prison was a modern supermax facility, all concrete and steel, designed to minimize human contact and maximize control. In his cell, which measured roughly 8 by 10 feet and contained only a metal cot bolted to the floor, a stainless steel toilet and sink combination, and a small metal shelf for personal items, Thomas spent his days in isolation. Other inmates knew who he was, the priest who had killed 10 men, and the guards kept him separated for his own protection. Prison has its own moral code, and those who hurt children or betray trust occupy the lowest tier. A priest-turned-killer fell into that category. Thomas was allowed 1 hour of recreation daily in a small concrete yard surrounded by high walls, walked there in restraints and constantly supervised. He requested a Bible, which was granted after security review, and spent hours reading passages he'd once preached about with conviction: forgiveness, redemption, the sanctity of life. The words that had once inspired him now felt like accusations. Sarah Chen visited him 6 months after his conviction. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to see him again. Professional curiosity, perhaps, a need for closure on a case that had consumed her life for nearly a year, or maybe something deeper about understanding the capacity for evil in seemingly good people. They sat across from each other in the prison's visiting area, a sterile room divided by reinforced glass, speaking through phones that crackled with static. Thomas looked older, thinner, his hair now completely white where it had been salt and pepper. Prison had aged him a decade in 6 months. Sarah asked him if he'd found any peace. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, before responding. "I pray constantly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, roughened by months of minimal use in solitary confinement. "I pray for the souls of the men I killed. Anthony Russo, who had a mother who loved him despite his crimes. Leonard Price, who had been trying to save money to leave Cleveland and start over. Vincent Shaw, who sent money to his ex-wife for their daughter's education. Ramon and Diego Martinez, who came to this country hoping for better lives. Carlos Mendez, who served his country and deserved better than what it gave him in return. Raymond Kowalski, Marcus Delgado, all of them. I pray for their families who will never see justice served in any meaningful way. I pray for forgiveness, though I don't deserve it and don't expect it. But mostly I pray that God will help me understand how I became this." He paused, his eyes filling with tears that he didn't bother to wipe away. "I spent 30 years hearing confessions, offering absolution, telling people that no sin was beyond God's mercy, that redemption was always possible for those who truly sought it. I believed that with everything I had. And now I'm living proof that evil doesn't just come from outside. It can grow inside anyone when fear and obsession take root, when righteousness curdles into self-justification, when protecting an institution becomes more important than protecting the souls that institution is supposed to serve." Sarah asked him about the tape one final time. Did he believe it ever really existed? Thomas smiled sadly, an expression of such profound sadness that Sarah felt it in her chest. "I don't know anymore, Detective. I've had 6 months to think about nothing else, and I honestly don't know. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. In the end, it doesn't matter. The tape was just an excuse, a justification my mind created for actions that had no justification. I was afraid of scandal, afraid of failure, afraid of my own inadequacy as a priest and a man. I'd built my entire identity around serving God and the church, and when I encountered a situation I couldn't control or solve within the rules, I broke. I let that fear turn me into a monster. 10 men are dead because I couldn't accept that some things are beyond my control, that sometimes there is no perfect solution, that protecting my pride and the church's reputation mattered more to me than human life. The Diocese of Cleveland released a comprehensive statement following Thomas's conviction, expressing profound sorrow and shame over the actions of one of their priests. Bishop William Donnelly, who had ordained Thomas 30 years earlier and considered him a friend, held a press conference at the diocese headquarters on Superior Avenue. Bishop Donnelly was 72 years old, a gentleman who had served the Cleveland diocese for 40 years, and he looked devastated as he read the statement. Father Thomas Brennan's actions represent a complete betrayal of everything our church stands for and everything the priesthood is meant to embody. We failed to recognize the signs of his mental and spiritual deterioration, and for that we must accept responsibility. We have established a victim assistance fund to provide financial support to the families of those killed, though we recognize that no amount of money can compensate for such profound loss. We are also implementing new protocols for monitoring the well-being of our priests, providing better mental health resources, and ensuring that those who serve our communities receive the support they need to fulfill their sacred duties without succumbing to the pressures and temptations that led Father Brennan so tragically astray. The diocese established a fund with an initial allocation of $500,000 for the victims' families, though most refused the money initially. They saw it as blood money, a public relations gesture that could never compensate for their losses. Eventually, some families accepted, using it for therapy, funeral expenses, or to support children left fatherless. The money came with no strings attached and no requirement to sign non-disclosure agreements, which the diocese hoped would demonstrate genuine remorse rather than legal maneuvering. St. Michael's Cathedral underwent a period of profound healing and change. Attendance initially dropped as parishioners struggled to reconcile the man they'd known with the murderer he'd become. Father Michael Rodriguez was temporarily assigned to help the parish through the transition, leading community healing sessions where people could express their anger, confusion, and grief. The confession booth, where Marcus had recorded his confession, was removed and destroyed in a small ceremony attended by parish leadership. It was replaced with a simple wooden chair and kneeler, as if physical changes could somehow cleanse the spiritual corruption that had taken place there. Anthony Russo's mother, Maria, spoke at a victims' impact panel organized by the prosecutor's office 6 months after sentencing. She was a small woman in her 70s, her hair covered by a black scarf in the traditional Italian style, her hands twisted with arthritis that made everyday tasks painful. She had worked as a seamstress for 50 years, taking in alterations and repairs, living modestly in the same house in Little Italy, where she'd raised 5 children. "My Anthony was no saint," she said, her voice breaking but determined to be heard. "He made bad choices from the time he was a teenager. He hurt people, broke laws, caused me more tears than I can count. I prayed for him every day, lit candles at church, begged God to turn his heart toward good. But he was my son, my baby boy who I held in my arms, who made me laugh with his jokes, who fixed my roof and my car even when he was in trouble with the law. He didn't deserve to die like that, hunted like an animal by a man who was supposed to represent God's mercy. Every day I ask myself, what kind of world do we live in where a priest becomes a killer? What kind of faith produces that? And I have no answers, only grief and anger, and the knowledge that my son died terrified, and alone in a parking lot behind a bar, and the man who killed him thought he was doing God's work." Her words echoed in the sterile community center where the panel was held, and there were no easy answers to her questions. The other victims' family members who attended, including Vincent Shaw's daughter, a college student named Jasmine, who spoke about growing up without her father, and Ramon Martinez's widow, Carla, who was pregnant with their second child when he was killed, shared similar stories of loss, anger, and confusion. In the months and years that followed, Thomas's case became a subject of extensive study in both theological and criminal psychology circles. The Catholic University of America hosted a symposium examining the confession seal in modern contexts, with theologians, canon lawyers, and ethicists debating whether ancient religious practices could withstand modern challenges like recording devices and digital surveillance. The consensus was complicated. The confession seal remained absolute in church teaching, but the symposium produced recommendations for priests to be trained in recognizing manipulation and psychological warfare tactics that could exploit the seal's protections. Criminal psychologists at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland conducted extensive studies of Thomas's case, examining how a person with no history of violence could become a serial killer seemingly overnight. Dr. Patricia Vance, a forensic psychologist who had interviewed Thomas multiple times for her research, published a paper titled "From Shepherd to Predator: Moral Rigidity and Violence in Religious Authority Figures." Her work explored how Thomas's inflexible adherence to principles, combined with obsessive thinking and social isolation, created conditions for violent decomposition. She noted that Thomas exhibited characteristics of what she termed righteous violence syndrome, killing driven not by sadistic pleasure or material gain, but by a distorted sense of protecting sacred values. Detective Sarah Chen eventually retired from the Cleveland Police Department after 22 years of service, though the Brennan case stayed with her in ways other cases hadn't. She took a position teaching criminal justice at Cleveland State University, using her experiences to train the next generation of investigators. She sometimes drove past St. Michael's Cathedral on her way home, looking up at its Gothic spires reaching toward the sky, and wondered about the nature of faith and justice. She'd seen countless criminals in her career, people who killed for money, for revenge, for pleasure, for reasons that made sense within their twisted logic. But Thomas Brennan was different. He'd killed for an idea, for the preservation of something he considered sacred, and in doing so had destroyed both that sacred thing and himself. During her lectures, Sarah would sometimes discuss the case without using names, presenting it as an example of how obsession could corrupt even the most principled individuals. Her students would debate whether Thomas deserved any sympathy, whether his motivation made his crimes better or worse than those committed for selfish reasons. The discussions never reached satisfying conclusions, because there weren't any. The confession tape, if it ever existed, was never found despite years of speculation and amateur investigation. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to the mystery, with hosts interviewing anyone remotely connected to the case. A popular podcast called Unholy Acts spent an entire season examining the Ohio Bloodbath, interviewing parishioners, family members of victims, legal experts, and theologians. They sent FOIA requests to law enforcement agencies, obtained court documents, and even hired private investigators to search for the tape. They found nothing definitive. Investigators eventually concluded that the tape had likely been destroyed by Raymond Kowalski after Marcus gave it to him, recognizing it as too dangerous to keep. Raymond, despite being a career criminal, understood leverage and liability. A recording that could expose his organization to legal action while simultaneously targeting a Catholic priest, creating potential enemies in both law enforcement and religious communities, was a liability he couldn't afford. The theory suggested he'd destroyed it within days of receiving it, perhaps never even telling Marcus he'd done so, letting Marcus believe the insurance policy still existed. Some crime enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists still search for it, convinced it's hidden somewhere in Cleveland's urban landscape, buried in a park, sealed in a wall, tucked into a safety deposit box under a false name. Online forums dedicated to true crime, cold cases feature threads about the tape, with amateur sleuths proposing theories and sharing supposed leads. But most law enforcement officials and serious investigators consider it a closed case. The tape had become less a piece of physical evidence and more a symbol of how fear and obsession can distort reality, creating monsters out of otherwise ordinary people. Father Thomas Brennan remains in the Ohio State Penitentiary as of this writing, his days measured out in the rigid routine of incarceration. Wake at 5:30 a.m., breakfast delivered through a slot in his cell door, 1 hour of recreation if he's approved, meals at scheduled times, lights out at 10 p.m. He leads a Bible study for other inmates twice weekly, though the irony of a convicted murderer teaching scripture is not lost on anyone, least of all Thomas himself. The sessions are conducted in a common area under heavy guard supervision, with inmates who've chosen to participate in the prison's limited religious programs. Thomas writes letters to the families of his victims, though most are returned unopened. The envelopes come back marked "Returned to Sender" or "Refused," accumulating in a box in the prison mailroom until they're eventually discarded. Maria Russo has never opened his letters. Jasmine Shaw burned hers in a small ceremony witnessed by her mother, Carla Martinez keeps hers in a drawer, unopened, unable to read them but also unable to destroy them. In one letter that was eventually made public when a journalist obtained it through a family member who chose to share it, Thomas wrote, "Dear Mrs. Rousseau, I cannot ask for your forgiveness because what I did is unforgivable. There are no words in any language that can express the depth of my remorse or the magnitude of my crime against your family. I can only tell you that I live every day with the full weight of my actions, and I will carry that weight until my last breath. I destroyed your son's life, destroyed your peace, destroyed everything I claimed to hold sacred. There is no redemption for me in this life, only the hope that God's mercy might extend to even the worst of his children, though I deserve none. I pray for Anthony's soul daily, asking God to grant him the peace and redemption that I stole from him in this world. I'm truly sorry, though those words are meaningless against the enormity of what I've done. May God forgive me, for you never should." The letter was written in neat handwriting on lined prison stationery, every word carefully chosen, and it revealed a man still struggling to comprehend his own transformation. Prison psychologists who evaluated Thomas regularly noted that he showed genuine remorse, scoring high on empathy assessments and demonstrating insight into his crimes that many inmates never achieved. But remorse couldn't resurrect the dead or heal the wounds he'd inflicted. The story of the Ohio bloodbath serves as a dark reminder of how easily righteousness can curdle into violence, how the best intentions can pave roads to unspeakable horror. In trying to protect the sacred seal of confession, Father Thomas Brennan violated every other commandment and principle his faith held dear. He broke, "Thou shalt not kill" 10 times over. He violated his vows of service and compassion. He transformed from a healer of souls into a destroyer of lives. The 10 men who died weren't innocent. Their crimes were real and had caused genuine suffering to countless victims, particularly the women they'd trafficked. But they were still human beings created in God's image, still souls capable of redemption, still fathers and sons and brothers whose lives were stolen by a man who believed he was serving a higher purpose. Cleveland's criminal underworld shifted in the wake of the murders, with Marcus Delgado's trafficking organization collapsing completely as members either went to ground, were arrested on various charges, or were absorbed into other criminal enterprises. The power vacuum was eventually filled by other groups, Russian organized crime networks, Mexican cartels, local gangs, because that's how these ecosystems work. One predator falls, and another rises to take its place. The women who had been victimized by Marcus's organization received varying degrees of justice and support. Some were identified and provided with victim services, counseling, and assistance returning to their home countries or rebuilding their lives. Others disappeared into the system or simply moved on, unwilling to engage with authorities or unable to overcome their trauma. But the story remained, whispered in bars along Euclid Avenue and told in cautionary tones in seminary classrooms across the country. It became part of Cleveland's dark folklore, the priest who became a killer, the confession tape that may never have existed, the 10 men who died because one man couldn't accept that some things are beyond human control. Theology professors used it as a case study in moral reasoning, asking students to grapple with impossible ethical dilemmas. When does protecting an institution justify breaking its fundamental principles? How should religious authorities respond when sacred practices are exploited by those with malicious intent? What are the limits of confidentiality when maintaining it enables ongoing harm? The case influenced church policy in subtle but meaningful ways. The Diocese of Cleveland, and eventually the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, issued updated guidelines for priests, acknowledging that while the confession seal remained absolutely inviolable, Priests who encountered credible threats or evidence of ongoing criminal activity could and should take appropriate action that didn't violate the seal itself. They could report general concerns to law enforcement without revealing specific details heard in confession. They could refuse absolution to penitents who showed no genuine contrition or willingness to stop harmful behavior. They could end confession sessions if they felt manipulated or threatened. Father Michael Rodriguez, who had testified at Thomas's trial and who continued serving Cleveland's Catholic community, often reflected on his friend's fall from grace. In homilies and in private conversations with other priests struggling with the burdens of ministry, Michael spoke about the danger of isolation, of bearing impossible weights alone, of letting pride and fear override common sense and community. He emphasized that priesthood was never meant to be solitary, that priests needed support systems, needed to share their struggles with trusted colleagues and superiors, needed to recognize when situations exceeded their capacity to handle alone. Thomas tried to solve an impossible problem by himself, Michael would say, his voice heavy with regret. He carried the weight of that recorded confession alone, letting it fester and grow in his mind until it consumed him. If he had come to me, to our bishop, to anyone, we could have helped him navigate it. We could have found a way to address the threat without resorting to violence. But he was too proud, too convinced that he had to protect the church single-handedly. And that isolation transformed a good man into a monster. St. Michael's Cathedral slowly healed, though the scar remained. A new priest, Father James Chen, no relation to Detective Sarah Chen, was assigned as pastor 3 years after Thomas's conviction. Father James was young, only 35, with a background in social work and a passion for community service that gradually rebuilt trust. He instituted open forums where parishioners could discuss their concerns, their doubts, their struggles with faith in the wake of scandal. He partnered with social service organizations to address human trafficking, creating programs that helped vulnerable populations before they could be exploited. The cathedral became known not for the horror that had occurred there, but for its commitment to redemptive justice and community healing. The confession booth, redesigned and rebuilt, once again became a place where souls sought absolution. But the new booth included clear signage reminding penitents that recording confessions was strictly forbidden, that such violations constituted both sacrilege and potentially criminal activity. It was a small acknowledgement of modern realities, intruding on ancient practices, a recognition that sacred spaces needed protection from technological exploitation. Detective Sarah Chen visited St. Michael's Cathedral once in her retirement, on a cold December afternoon, not unlike the day she'd first interviewed Thomas. She sat in a pew near the back, looking up at the vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that painted the floor in colors that shifted as clouds passed overhead. She wasn't religious. Her parents' Buddhism had been more cultural than devout, and she'd never felt called to any particular faith. But she appreciated the architecture, the history, the sense of something larger than individual human lives. Father James noticed her and approached, introducing himself. When he learned who she was, he thanked her for her work on the case, for bringing justice even when it must have been difficult to pursue a priest. Sarah appreciated his candor. They talked for nearly an hour, discussing justice and mercy, punishment and redemption, the complicated legacy of Thomas Brennan. "Do you think he can ever be redeemed?" Father James asked, genuinely curious about the perspective of someone who had no religious stake in the answer. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think redemption is something each person has to define for themselves. Thomas destroyed 10 lives and countless more by extension, the families, the communities, the faith people had in institutions meant to protect them. Nothing he does for the rest of his life will bring those men back or erase the trauma he caused. But can he find some kind of peace? Can he do some good from where he is? Maybe. I've seen worse people find ways to contribute positively despite their crimes. Whether that constitutes redemption or just damage control, I don't know. Father James nodded thoughtfully. The Church teaches that God's mercy is infinite, that no sin places someone beyond redemption if they truly repent. But it also teaches that earthly consequences remain, that forgiveness doesn't erase justice. Thomas will spend the rest of his life in prison, and that's appropriate given what he did. Whether God forgives him is between Thomas and God. But I pray for him as I pray for all souls in darkness, hoping they find light somehow. Years passed, and the Ohio bloodbath gradually faded from public consciousness, replaced by newer tragedies and scandals. Cleveland moved forward as cities do, absorbing trauma and continuing. The neighborhoods where the murders occurred saw varying fates. Some gentrified as young professionals moved in, seeking affordable housing near downtown, while others continued struggling with poverty and crime. The bars and warehouses where Thomas had killed mostly remained, physical spaces that held dark memories for those who knew their history. Anthony Russo's mother, Maria, died 7 years after her son's murder, her heart simply giving out according to her doctor, though her family believed it was broken beyond repair. She was buried next to Anthony in Calvary Cemetery, a sprawling Catholic cemetery on Cleveland's east side, where generations of Italian-American families rested. At her funeral, attended by dozens of extended family members and neighbors from Little Italy, her surviving children spoke about how Anthony's murder had destroyed her, how she'd never recovered from the shock of learning that a priest, a representative of the faith she'd devoted her life to, had killed her son. Vincent Shaw's daughter, Jasmine, graduated from college and became a social worker specializing in helping children of incarcerated parents, turning her pain into purpose. She occasionally spoke at victim advocacy events, sharing her story of losing her father to violence and learning to build a life despite that loss. She never forgave Thomas Brennan. Forgiveness felt like betrayal of her father's memory, but she found ways to move forward, to create meaning from meaninglessness. The Martinez family, Carla and her 2 children, moved back to Honduras, unable to remain in Cleveland, where every street corner held memories of Ramon and Diego. Extended family helped them rebuild their lives, though the trauma never fully healed. Carla sometimes wondered about the priest who killed her husband, whether he thought about the children who would grow up without fathers, whether he understood the ripple effects of his violence. In his cell at the Ohio State Penitentiary, Father Thomas Brennan aged into his 60s, his hair completely white now, his body weakened by years of confinement and limited exercise. He developed arthritis in his hands, the same hands that had once elevated the Eucharist and had later choked the life from human beings, making it painful to write his letters or turn pages of his Bible. Prison doctors provided minimal treatment, ibuprofen, and occasional physical therapy, nothing that would significantly improve his condition. Thomas's days followed unchanging patterns. He woke before dawn, prayed the Liturgy of the Hours from memory. Having memorized it during his years of freedom, ate breakfast alone in his cell, read scripture, wrote letters that mostly went unread, led his Bible study sessions, and returned to his cell for lights out. He thought constantly about the men he'd killed, their faces haunting him in quiet moments. He wondered about their final thoughts, whether they'd had time to pray, whether they understood why they were dying. The question that tormented him most was whether finding and destroying the tape would have been worth it, even if he'd succeeded. If the tape had been in Anthony Russo's pocket that first night, if Thomas had grabbed it and destroyed it and stopped there, would one murder have been justified to protect the church? The question had no satisfactory answer, because murder was murder, because taking a life could never be justified by protecting an institution or a principle. But Thomas's mind circled it endlessly, trying to find some way to make sense of choices that defied sense. On quiet nights, Thomas would pray for wisdom he should have possessed years earlier, for the clarity that came too late. He'd ask God why he'd been tested with something beyond his capacity to handle, why the confession seal, meant to protect souls and encourage honest confession, had been exploited to create an impossible situation. But he knew those questions were really accusations against himself, attempts to shift responsibility for choices he'd made freely. No one had forced him to kill. He'd chosen violence when other options existed, going to his bishop, refusing Marcus's confession, accepting that some situations had no perfect solution. The 10th anniversary of the murders passed with minimal media coverage. A few local news stations ran brief retrospectives, interviewing Sarah Chen and some family members willing to speak. A graduate student at Cleveland State University wrote a dissertation analyzing the case from a criminological perspective. True crime podcasters did anniversary episodes, rehashing familiar details for audiences who'd forgotten or never knew the story. But mostly, it was just another day. In his cell, Thomas marked the anniversary by fasting and prayer, as he did every year. He listed each victim by name: Anthony Russo, Leonard Price, Vincent Shaw, Ramon Martinez, Diego Martinez, Raymond Kowalski, Carlos Mendez, 3 others whose names he would carry to his grave, and prayed for their souls. He begged their forgiveness, knowing it would never come. He asked God for mercy, knowing he didn't deserve it, and he accepted, finally and fully, that this was his life now, would be his life until death released him from the consequences of his choices. The confession tape remained unfound, a phantom that had driven Thomas to commit atrocities. Whether it existed in some forgotten storage unit or safety deposit box, whether it had been destroyed years earlier, whether it was hidden in plain sight or had never been real, these questions no longer mattered. The tape was just an object, a collection of digital data on a microchip or magnetic strip. What mattered were the choices Thomas had made in response to its threatened existence, the violence he'd chosen over faith, the death he'd delivered instead of redemption. Father Thomas Brennan sits in his cell tonight, as he will tomorrow night, and every night until he dies within these concrete walls. He prays though he's no longer sure anyone is listening. He reads his Bible, though the words that once brought comfort now feel like accusations. He remembers the faces of the men he killed, their final moments, the terror in their eyes, and he understands, with a clarity born of years of painful reflection, that there are some things that can never be confessed away, some sins that stain the soul permanently, some lines that once crossed can never be uncrossed. The confession booth at St. Michael's Cathedral sits in the cathedral's nave, once again serving its sacred purpose. Parishioners enter to confess their sins: infidelity, dishonesty, anger, greed, all the human failings that plague every soul. Priests sit on the other side of the lattice, offering absolution and guidance, maintaining the ancient tradition of sacramental confession. The space is sacred again, or perhaps it always was, the holiness of the practice larger than the flawed humans who participate in it. But those who know the history, who remember Father Thomas Brennan and the Ohio Bloodbath, understand that sacred spaces exist in a world of complexity and danger. They understand that evil can corrupt even the holiest institutions when good people make terrible choices. They understand that protecting principles sometimes requires wisdom to know when flexibility serves truth better than rigidity. The story of Father Thomas Brennan ends not with redemption or resolution, but with a man living out the consequences of his choices in a concrete cell, surrounded by the ghosts of those he killed. It ends with families still grieving, communities still healing, and a church still wrestling with how one of its shepherds became a wolf. It ends with questions about faith and justice, about when protecting institutions harms the people those institutions are meant to serve. And somewhere, perhaps in a landfill or destroyed years ago, or hidden in a place no one will ever find, the confession tape exists or doesn't exist, its status ultimately irrelevant to the lives destroyed in its pursuit. The tape was never really the point. It was just the excuse, the justification, the phantom that allowed Thomas Brennan to transform from priest to predator while telling himself he served a higher purpose. The Ohio bloodbath remains a cautionary tale, a dark chapter in Cleveland's history, a reminder that righteousness without wisdom becomes violence, that protecting symbols can destroy what they symbolize, and that the road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions, especially when those intentions prioritize institutions over the humans they're meant to serve.